And the argument that they make is that Columbus came over to the Americas and he enslaved all the peoples and he raped, killed, pillaged, and burned, and he was a vicious tyrant and a murderer, and he did all of these awful things because he was a genocidal maniac. And the problem with that narrative is not just that it's unfair or it's out of historical context, it's actually that it's not true. In the words of Carol Delaney, who is a preeminent Columbus historian, the left accuses Columbus of things that he actually did not do, that other Spaniards did, that actually in many cases Christopher Columbus tried to stop the Spaniards from doing.
I'm Dave Rubin, and we're doing a special Columbus Day edition of the Rubin Report today. I am joined by the most notorious Christopher Columbus apologist on all of the internet, a man who also wrote one best-selling book with no words and another best-selling book with words that the New York Times decided not to put on their bestseller list. Also, he left me behind in Crazy Cali while he moved to the free state of Tennessee. Yeah, you know who it is. Michael Knowles, welcome back to the Rubin Report.
Great to be with you, sir, albeit from afar. I hope to see you in person again soon, if I can make it back to that, failed state of Mussolini's California.
Yes, thank you for sticking me right at the beginning of this thing. Now, Knowles, I asked my guys, because it is Columbus Day, I asked my guys who is the foremost expert on Christopher Columbus, and they said, they gave me a long list of names. We couldn't get any of those people.
Not a single one.
Yeah, we couldn't get them. And then they said Michael Knowles, and I said, well, Chris Columbus, I thought perhaps you were the expert on the director Chris Columbus of Home Alone and Harry Potter and Mrs. Doubtfire. Have you ever heard that joke before?
Yeah, I have not heard that joke. It's not a joke, Dave. I would consider myself expert on both Chris's, both very important, though I suppose today we celebrate the old Italian one.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about Christopher Columbus, because I actually know that, joking aside, this is sort of close to your heart, the way that they've sort of changed the very life and the history of Christopher Columbus. I've watched a couple things that you've done on this before. So actually, I'm not even going to ask you a question to start. Why don't you just start? Where should we start when talking about Christopher Columbus?
I think we ought to quote that great historian, Tony Soprano. I'll clean up the language a little bit for your show because it's a family program. When his son AJ is going off about some Howard Zinn revisionist woke nonsense about Christopher Columbus, Tony cuts him off and says, "Hey, enough of that. In this house, Christopher Columbus is a hero, all right? And that's the end of the story." And I think that's absolutely true. There are two reasons here why we focus on Columbus Day and why this is near and dear to my heart. First of all, the identity politics. I am an Italian-American from New York. Columbus Day is considered an Italian-American holiday. It was instituted for the first time in 1892. This was on the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue. The proximate cause of this is that the year prior, 11 Italian Americans had been lynched in New Orleans. It's the largest mass lynching in American history. And so to make the Italians feel nice and welcome here in America, there was this initial Columbus Day celebrated, and then later on Franklin Roosevelt made it an annual thing. So the Italians, especially those from the tri-state area, feel very close to it. Now, beyond the usual sort of identity pride that everyone seems to be focused on these days, why on his own merits would Columbus get a holiday? Well, the answer is simple. He is the man who discovered America. Without Christopher Columbus, we would not be here. And he's a great embodiment of Western civilization. He is an Italian, a Genoan of low birth, who is basically a self-made man. And he educated himself, and he traveled all over. He became one of the greatest sailors of his age. Even when he was still a young man, he had this crazy idea to sail to the Indies, to find a short sea route to the Indies. The reasons for this were economic, to find a trade route, but this is often overlooked, they were religious, they were spiritual. Mm-hmm. He wanted to, he was a devout Catholic, he wanted to fund another crusade, actually, and on his ships, he said the Book of Hours, he led the men in prayers, he had confession in the Eucharist before he set sail. He was a deeply pious, religious man, and he was intrepid, he was fearless. He sailed to Iceland, to Ireland, to parts of Africa. He makes it to the Indies, he goes 3 times, discovers a new world, and because he so embodies our civilization, the left hates his guts.
So let's go with that for just a moment. So you're basically telling me he used the tools of the white patriarchy to come here and slaughter people, right? Isn't that where
yes.
you're going next with this?
You know, the Italians are a swarthy people, getting back to our identity politics, so I don't know where they fall on white supremacy, but I think, yes, to the left, he was an embodiment of white supremacy, and the argument that they make is that Columbus came over to the Americas, and he enslaved all the peoples, and he raped, killed, pillaged, and burned, and he was a vicious tyrant and a murderer, and he did all of these awful things because he was a genocidal maniac. And the problem with that narrative is not just that it's unfair or it's out of historical context, it's actually that it's not true. In the words of Carol Delaney, who is a preeminent Columbus historian, the left accuses Columbus of things that he actually did not do, that other Spaniards did, that actually in many cases Christopher Columbus tried to stop the Spaniards from doing. When they first landed, they met the Taino people. Columbus told the Spaniards, don't be cruel to these people. Now, there were other islanders in the area, notably the Carib Islanders, who were a little less kind and polite than the Taino Indians. Columbus noticed that the Tainos had a lot of scars on them, on some of them, and so he asked, where is that from? It was from the Carib Islanders. The Carib Islanders is where we get the word for cannibal. They were an island of cannibals. This is well documented, and this brought the idea of cannibalism even into our lexicon, our cultural lexicon. So not all of the natives created equal. Christopher Columbus befriended one of the Indian leaders and actually raised his orphaned son. So to call him racist, bigoted, genocidal, it is so overly simplistic. It's so dishonest. And frankly, it's more fanciful and fabulous than any of the traditional narratives we have that admire Columbus.
So since we're taping this actually a couple days before Columbus Day, I'm sure that we're in agreement that there's no doubt like 80,000 hit pieces out right now. They're doing hit pieces, post-death hit pieces on Christopher Columbus right now. There's no doubt. They're saying, slaughtered indigenous and all of the stuff. Does this, in some ways for you, because you care about this, and at the identity politics level, it's okay to be an Italian, proud of Italian heritage and history and all of those things, that it's like we can't defend any of our freedoms now. We can't even defend our current, history from 10 years ago, that this is one that it almost feels like the ship has sailed, no pun intended. Like they're coming for Christopher Columbus, whether we like it or not.
They are, and these hit pieces, they crop up every year, and they've really increased in frequency and vitriol since the mid-2000s. And whenever you look at a hit piece, what's the first question you gotta ask? The first question is, what are the sources? Where did they get this stuff from? It was a little weird that these hit pieces all cropped up in the 2000s, and the explanation was that new documents revealed that Columbus was not a great guy, that actually he was a terrible genocidal maniac. What were the documents? It's actually, you'll notice on a lot of these articles you can't find, they don't cite their sources. It all goes back to a document from a man named Francisco de Bobadilla. Francisco de Bobadilla was Christopher Columbus's rival for political power in the New World. Columbus was not just the greatest explorer of his age, but he also was the governor of the Indies. He was a less competent governor than he was an explorer. And actually a lot of the harsher treatment of the Native Americans was as a result of Christopher Columbus being outfoxed politically by much less scrupulous men. And so one of the people who stabbed Columbus in the back was this guy, de Bobadilla. Regardless of what, I'm not saying Christopher Columbus was perfect. Obviously he wasn't. He was a human. No human is perfect. Not in this day and age, at least. And I can really only name one person. One, maybe two. I don't know. You, Dave, you're a nice guy, but I don't think so. So
Thank you.
When we look at this historical record, I think the comparison here would be if you were looking at a history of Hillary Clinton and you said, okay, well, what's a fair history of Hillary Clinton? How about this one written by Donald Trump? That's what I'm going to use this as my sole evidence that Hillary, or vice versa, the history of Donald Trump written by Hillary Clinton. Regardless of the facts on the ground, and we can talk about all of the complex facets of Columbus's life, it's simply preposterous to take his chief political rival as the gospel truth on the man, especially when that narrative is so contradicted by many other esteemed historians and people who were there at the time. I mean, I think of Bartolomé de las Casas, the first resident bishop of the Americas. Bartolomé de las Casas was honest about Columbus's faults, and he said, the man didn't govern perfectly, but he's considered one of the greatest defenders of the Native Americans, and yet de las Casas remained a lifelong admirer of Christopher Columbus. And I think we need to take into account that historical perspective as well before we throw the guy over the ship, as it were.
Right. All right, so with that in mind, let's spend our remaining time talking about the good stuff. We know the controversies are coming. We know what they're going to say. Okay, so be it. And by the way, none of these people are leaving America. None of these people are doing anything other than complaining and everything else. But let's be productive here and get some real knowledge. Just on the exploration part itself, are there any interesting stories that sort of got him to decide, I'm going to get in a boat and see what happens? Like, it's a pretty crazy thing. I mean, the only comparable thing we have in modern times is that, Elon Musk is, trying to send people to Mars or that kind of thing.
Yes. The thing you need to know about Christopher Columbus's exploration is that the man was unique. This is not something to be looked at as the mere tides of history and someone was going to discover the Americas and, if it wasn't Chris, it would have been somebody else. No, Christopher Columbus was so ruthlessly determined and ambitious to find this sea route that he, first of all, educated himself. He educated himself, became literate, became a Spaniard. He was an Italian guy, but he became a Spaniard because he thought that was going to be basically his best chance to go on over. He lobbied the King of Portugal. The King of Portugal refused. He then goes and lobbies the King and Queen of Spain. They refuse as well, but through basically sheer tyranny of will and personality, he finally gets Queen Isabella, to relent and fund this voyage. He had already had a lot of experience at sea before that, and then he sets to sea. What does he have? All these wonderful tools at his disposal? No, he's got a compass and the stars. He used dead reckoning to make it across. So you'll often hear people today say, Christopher Columbus, he didn't even end up where he wanted to end up. He wanted to end up in the East Indies. Right. He found Bermuda, or whatever. Not Bermuda. He found the Bahamas. He found the Caribbean. And you think, well, I don't know. The guy had a compass and he had the stars. How far would you make it? Probably not very far. He also had to put down
I can't get to the 405 without my GPS, so I got you.
I know, of course not. None of us can. On this voyage, as they were going a far greater distance, I think, than many people were prepared to undertake, Christopher Columbus had to put down a mutiny. So here you do see a little bit of his leadership skill. Maybe he wasn't the greatest governor of the Indies, but he did keep these men in line, and they finally do spot land. And he, I think, owes a lot of it to his faith in God. I mean, when he finally does land in the Caribbean, the first island he lands at, he calls it San Salvador, right? The Savior. Mm-hmm. And he deals with all of these difficult political problems. He is brought back to Spain in chains, so he undergoes a lot of persecution. And Columbus doesn't just complain about this, by the way. He thinks he was unjustly persecuted. I think he was largely unjustly persecuted. There are some cynical motives for it, which is that as long as Christopher Columbus was a criminal, then the crown didn't need to pay him what they owed him. So there were a lot of political machinations going on in Spain. But he understood that perhaps he was suffering because of his own failings. So he writes about this in his journals. So he actually does look in on himself. And the two-dimensional picture is just so silly, not to harp too much on the criticisms of him, but I think there is an important one that we need to focus on here, which is ourselves. In the spirit of Columbus looking in on his own failings, we need to look in on ourselves. Without Christopher Columbus, we would not be here. Without Christopher Columbus, the Hispanic people would not exist. There would be no such thing as Latinos or Hispanics, right? Which is, Latino people come from the mixture of the American indigenous peoples and the Spaniards who come over. So if you're an Hispanic person, you owe your very ethnic identity to Christopher Columbus. And we, of course, owe our existence here in the New World. And so I think before we cast stones, we should recognize that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, this giant in particular, and yet we think that we're flying.
Yeah. What else don't we know about those first days when he reaches the New World? Is there anything particularly interesting from it's just hard to imagine? Well, how long did it take, by the way?
So I forget the exact number of days. I used to know this pretty well, but I forget the exact timing. There are some interesting stories, though, when he lands on the first time. And I think this is also really important when we're talking about the Native Americans, or the indigenous peoples from the region, because I don't mean to downplay the suffering that they endured. Many of them did endure a lot of suffering. But the Native Americans that he encountered, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, were all sorts of different people, and some of them were good, and some of them were not so good, and some of the groups of Native Caribbeans were good, and some of them were not so good. And the thing we find about them when we read Columbus's writings, when we read the writings of other people who were on the voyage, is that those indigenous peoples were a lot like us. That is, they were people. Mm-hmm. And they had some good characteristics and they had some bad characteristics. And the way that these peoples developed over time, like when you're talking about that interaction of Columbus with the natives there, you're talking about the first modern colonial interactions in the modern era. And so if there are going to be problems, if there are going to be failures, if there are going to be mistakes made, recognize you're talking about something that is so historic that Columbus is credited in many ways with giving birth to this modern era that we're all living in.
Would you like to see the modern American Italian community stand up more for Columbus's legacy? I mean, that episode of The Sopranos, I know the one you're talking about, it's the very famous Columbus Day episode when they're trying to tear down, some activists are trying to tear down a statue somewhere in Jersey. I wonder, should the Italian community be getting more up in arms over this?
I do think that the Italians have a special role here in defending Columbus. I don't love identity politics, and it's not like I wake up every morning and I think, gosh, I'm proudest of the fact that my skin is a little swarthy and I eat cannoli and things like that. But the Italians have a special role here. If they're not going to defend Columbus, who will? And the Italians ought to be happy about their influence on America. I mean, there are a lot of first of all, America's named after an Italian, Amerigo Vespucci, the map maker. You've got the Verrazzano Bridge. You've got, Christopher Columbus, obviously, so many places named after him. And I think this raises another question. Why are towns, universities, countries, whole countries named after Christopher Columbus? Why did people once admire him and they don't admire him anymore? I suppose part of that might be because unscrupulous journalists are relying on ridiculous historical records. But I suspect it has to do more with ourselves. We don't like ourselves so much anymore as a civilization. And Columbus, because he played such a role in developing that civilization and embodying it, I think he bears a lot of the brunt of this sort of thing. You asked for interesting episodes from those first encounters he had. Well, most of what we see from those earliest encounters between Columbus and the natives are him imploring people to treat them well, please Spaniards, do not deceive the natives, do not deceive them in trade, do not be too harsh on them. And that side of the man you never really get to see. Later on, more difficult circumstances developed, of course. No one is denying that. But it reminds me of Chesterton's fence. G.K. Chesterton, the English writer, has this famous idea that there are two kinds of reformers, right? The reformer who goes up and sees a fence in the middle of nowhere, just a white fence, doesn't seem to serve any purpose, and he says, tear down that fence. I have no reason, I have no idea why that fence was erected in the first place. And then there's another type of reformer who says, hold on a second. If you do not know the purpose of that fence, if you don't know why that was erected in the first place, then don't touch it. Go figure out why it was erected in the first place and then tear it down. And I think that's what we should begin with here, is a little bit of humility to say, why was this man admired for so very long? Well, maybe shockingly, it's us here in 2021 who are missing something. And it's not just the deluded old awful people who came before us that we've got to tear down.
Well, that kind of feels like the right ending. I think you did it. You brought the old into the new. You brought the old world to the new world. We bridged the sea.
We have done it. We've reached the sea. I hope we can defend the great Christopher Columbus. I hope people don't tear down his statues too much into the near future, because the thing is, when you tear down your entire country, when you tear down your entire civilization, some of those statues might clobber you and clobber the things that you love, but you're going to end up living amid ruins. And All cultures, all civilizations are going to have to admire certain people. We're going to have to admire certain values. And I want to live in a civilization that admires the great men who came before us, who gave us our culture, that admires the intrepid, determined, faithful, intelligent, ambitious sort of episodes that I think are really well typified and really well exemplified by Christopher Columbus. Or we're going to admire a lot of the bad guys who are running around, running roughshod over our culture. Make your choice. Everybody's got to serve somebody.
In many ways, that's exactly what the whole damn thing is about right now. And Knowles, you are the living embodiment of Christopher Columbus because you left Los Angeles for the uncharted, the unknown country of Tennessee. It's a country,
This
right?
is true. And I just like Christopher Columbus, I've had wonderful encounters with the natives here in Tennessee as well.
Knowles, thanks for doing this. Have a happy Columbus Day, and I'll see you in Tennessee soon, and then we'll see if they'll let you back in LA. I have no idea.
Ciao.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about politics instead of nonstop yelling, check out our politics playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.